Okay, our next speaker is Dr. Alicia Cloete. She also graduated from Onderstepoort in 2011, and for the past 8 years, she's been working as a state veterinarian at the Department of Land Reform and Rural Development at Disease Control. Dr. Alicia, thank you for your presentations. She's going to talk about brucellosis and tuberculosis, whether we've lost the battle or not. So looking forward to your presentation, and thank you for your time.
Thanks a lot, Eliane, and good morning to everyone. I'll just put my video off while I'm doing the presentation. I'll put it on again afterwards. Let me just quickly share the tray. Okay, Eliane, if you can maybe just indicate if I'm in presentation mode.
Thank you, we can see it clearly.
Okay, great, thanks so much. Okay, so as Eliane introduced the next presentation, we're going to be talking about brucellosis and tuberculosis, two very important cattle diseases, especially in dairies, and asking the question, have we lost the battle? Okay, so as an outline to what we're going to be covering today, we're going to first cover some background on these two diseases. So the complexity of the two diseases, why it's important, current legislation and control measures, and also the history of these two diseases in the country. And only then can we attempt to answer the question if we have lost the battle or not. Okay, so firstly, an introduction when it comes to dairy farming. It's definitely a passion and a business. I just listened to the last bit of Dr. Gordon's talk just now, and that clearly indicates that, yeah, if you're a consultant, you need to run it as a well-oiled machine, a proper business, but definitely there's a lot of passion involved. Dairy farmers contribute to food safety and security in the country, worldwide as well. And of course, the production of milk and milk products need to be ethical, economically viable, and also safe for your consumers. So you definitely have active inputs that are required to manage and prevent your different types of risk when it comes to dairy farming. And that would include your diseases, so disease prevention and disease management. And you definitely need to include brucellosis and tuberculosis in your disease prevention and management plan. Okay, so firstly, to introduce brucellosis. So brucellosis is caused by a bacteria, Brucella abortus. It's an intracellular bacteria, and it causes a chronic debilitating disease. The main symptom that we see in cattle is abortion, usually in the last trimester, but you can also see other reproductive effects like weak calves being born, retained placentas, bull infertility, and then hygromas or swelling of the knees. You do see in chronic cases as well. The bacteria can also be shed in the milk. Then it's a viable bacteria that can be spread to other to calves and to humans as well if the milk is not pasteurized. And unfortunately, no treatment is available in cattle. Okay, cows get infected by sniffing or licking aborted fetuses, placenta, birth fluids, or a newly born calf. This is because during the birth process, a lot of that bacteria is shed into the environment and through these tissues as well. So this is the main way in which brucellosis is transmitted. Then also by drinking of infected milk. So if calves consume milk from infected cows that are shedding, and then, of course, also grazing on contaminated pasture or drinking contaminated water. This would, for example, be in a camp where an infected cow calved or aborted. You get environmental contamination. And if they graze in that area, they could also be exposed to the bacteria. You can also get an intrauterine infection of the fetus, so where it's directly transmitted from the cow to the calf in utero before they are born. You can also get contact with other infected cows, for example, on neighboring farms, or if you go to a show, if there's any environmental contamination, they can pick up the infection that way. And remember as well that bulls can become sterile if they're infected by brucellosis or if you vaccinate them, because we use live vaccines to help control brucellosis. And we'll talk about that a bit more later on. Okay, so just once again, the picture just showing cows are curious creatures. They sniff and lick anything that seems new to them. So you'll often find when a cow is given birth or even if she aborted, most of the herd will come and sort of look what's going on, sniff around the area, and unfortunately that's the point where they're most prone to getting infected. Like I said, with the normal birth process or abortion, it releases millions of these bacteria into the environment. Then keep us in mind as well that brucellosis is a zoonosis. So zoonotic disease is a disease that gets transmitted from animals to humans. So here your farmer's family and the workers on the farm would be at risk. So basically anyone that's in contact with the animals or that's drinking unpasteurized milk or dairy products. Okay, so transmission to humans is mainly through raw milk from infected cows, but then also if you're handling the placenta or birth fluids or abortions from infected cows, you can also be infected if you accidentally get a needle stick injury if you're vaccinating cattle because it's a live vaccine. And then also if you're slaughtering infected cattle, if you're cutting into infected tissues, you can also pick up brucellosis in that way. Just a note there that infected cattle that are slaughtered at registered abattoirs and that are slaughtered properly and where the carcasses are hung so that the meat's pH drops, that meat is safe for human consumption. Your risk when it comes to meat and eating organs would be if it's an at-home slaughter and you don't take reasonable precautions, and if you then don't cook certain organs or the meat properly, you could be exposed. So the meat that you buy from your supermarkets are considered safe from brucellosis. So in humans, the symptoms of brucellosis is typical flu-like symptoms. You just don't feel well, you've got body aches and pains, you can get a recurrent fever. Some people get chronic headaches and start feeling depressed, but it can also affect many other organ systems depending on where the bacteria lodges in your body. So it can also affect human reproductive organs, and just bearing in mind that this disease can become chronic in humans as well if it's not treated. So there is treatment available for humans. You go on a course of specific antibiotics, and the earlier you get the treatment, the better to try and get rid of this bacteria. Because if you ignore the symptoms, you don't get tested and you don't get treated, this is when the disease can become chronic. Okay, so that's in a nutshell brucellosis. So the next disease we're looking at is tuberculosis. Okay, so bovine tuberculosis is caused by Mycobacterium bovis. You might recall that with humans, we get infected by Mycobacterium tuberculosis, but we can also get infected by Mycobacterium bovis, the one that causes disease in cattle. Mycobacterium bovis also intracellular bacteria, and it also causes a chronic debilitating disease. Your main symptoms with bovine TB is weight loss, deterioration, decreased production, coughing, and eventual death of the animal, mainly also depending on the organ system affected. In cattle, it would usually also be the lungs that's mainly affected, as with humans with human tuberculosis. Okay, the TB organism might also be shed in the milk, so it can be transmitted via that route. And there used to be a treatment program available for infected cattle, but that has been discontinued. It's now only if there are really valuable animals or let's say different species like chimpanzees or some of the great apes that are infected with tuberculosis, they can apply to the director animal health to allow for treatment, but it's something that's not done routinely. It's because you need several antibiotics to run the treatment course. It's also given for a long period of time. So we prefer not to just routinely treat animals and only do it in, almost want to say, really important cases where an animal needs to be preserved. Okay, so infection of cows is mainly through inhalation of infective respiratory droplets. And there you can imagine if you're in a milking shed and you've got quite a few animals in there, if there's a sick animal coughing, very similar to us as humans. If you're in a very busy restaurant with lots of people and someone coughs, it's easy to shed the infective organism and get sick. So then also for calves, the drinking of infected milk from infected animals, and then also through bacterial contamination of your feed troughs, your licks, and your water bowls as well. So obviously, if the animals are coughing in that area, you can get contamination. Okay, then also through contact with other infected cows, for example, through neighboring farms or at shows. And like I mentioned, with the dairy parlors, your enclosed spaces make it almost a bit easier for these respiratory droplets to be inhaled versus being in an open outside area. Okay, keep in mind here as well that with bovine tuberculosis, this is also zoonosis, so it can also be transmitted from animals to humans. So once again, the vet, farmer's family, and the workers on the farm are at risk. And just to mention as well, with both brucellosis and tuberculosis, but specifically tuberculosis, it basically can affect any mammal. So you can get, for example, if a dog or a cat would start eating pieces of meat or organs that's got TB lesions in it, they can also actually pick up TB. So these two organisms can be transmitted to multiple species. Okay, so for transmission of bovine TB to humans, usually this is through the consumption of raw milk and milk products from infected cows. And then also in the case of TB, consumption of undercooked infected organs or meat where there are TB lesions, and then also through respiratory droplets. So going back to that milking parlor example, if there are quite a few infected cows that are coughing in the parlor and you're working there, you can also inhale those respiratory droplets. Even during the slaughter process, if you cut into lungs or lymph nodes that have got active TB lesions, you can also, if there's, let's say, quite a few animals that are being slaughtered, that will also potentially aerosolize the bacteria, and you can also inhale it and become infected. So symptoms with TB, also typically flu-like, body aches and pains, recurrent fever, can also affect your reproductive organs or any other organ as well, depending on where the bacteria lodge, and it can cause tiredness as well. So you'll see with both these diseases, they don't show very specific symptoms. It's just more generalized: fever, body aches and pains, feeling depressed, not eating well. So that just also shows the importance of, if you're not feeling well and you go to the doctor, to give them a proper history of what you're exposed to. So if you're working with dairy animals, or you've been exposed to a herd that's infected with TB or brucellosis, it's important to tell your medical practitioner that, so that they know, what to test you for and what consideration they need to give for the symptoms that you're showing. Otherwise, you'll just get a generalized treatment and no one will know what you actually have. Okay, so treatment for bovine TB in humans, you've got your antibiotics available as well. So at least if you pick up the disease, it can be treated. But you're keeping in mind, as with human TB, you do get your resistant strains as well. So if you're not feeling well and you think you're infected, better to seek treatment sooner rather than later. Because the quicker you're treated, the better to try to get rid of the organism as well. Okay, now we're moving over to the complexity of these two diseases. So remember here that both brucellosis and tuberculosis in cattle are considered herd diseases and not diseases of just individual animals. And this is because in an infected herd, the cattle that currently test negative on your tests might still be incubating the disease, because both brucellosis and tuberculosis being intracellular bacteria, they might have very prolonged incubation periods. Incubation period being the time from when you were first exposed to the bacteria until you start showing clinical signs. And let's say you've got 100 cow herd and you tested them for brucellosis or tuberculosis, and 30 out of the 100 animals tested positive on your test. That means you still put that whole herd under quarantine, because the other 70 that are currently testing negative could potentially still be incubating the disease and test positive later on. So that's why you won't just focus on and quarantine the positive animals. You'll focus and quarantine that whole herd that has been in contact with each other. Okay, then also with both brucellosis and tuberculosis, infected cattle might actually look quite healthy. So with brucellosis, you don't always see these abortion storms in infected brucellosis herds, especially if they're infected chronically. And then also with TB, depending on how new the infection is in the herd, if they only recently picked it up, you won't necessarily see those old, thin cows that are walking around coughing, because it takes some time for the disease to progress. So it's not always easy just looking at a herd, determining if they're infected with one of these two bacteria. So this just again highlights the importance of testing the whole eligible herd to determine their brucellosis and tuberculosis status. Okay, so firstly, testing for brucellosis. So when you have herds that you know have tested negative before, or unknown herds that you haven't tested before, initially you would test your serum twice, 2 months apart. For serological tests, you use your Rose-Bengal test as a screening test because it's more sensitive. And then you would use your complement fixation test on any RBT positives to confirm if the disease is really present. And then you also have your milk ring test that's done monthly on your bulk tank samples. And then for direct agent identification, you can do culture. So you can collect certain organ samples or milk to see if you can culture the bacteria as well. And this is always important in a herd to confirm if what type of strain of the organism is present as well. So you won't just rely on your blood test. As soon as animals are slaughtered that are infected, you will collect samples to try and culture the organism as well. Remember, for brucellosis, the interpretation is done on a herd basis, not only on an individual test result. So you first look at all the results from the animals in the herd, and then you can decide whether the herd itself is positive or negative, and then you go back to the individual results so that you can then determine, based on certain cutoff points, which individuals are currently testing positive and currently testing negative. Okay, so when it comes to testing for tuberculosis, it's a bit different. Okay, so initially your negative and unknown status herds, you'll test intradermally twice, and you do this 3 months apart. So that's basically where you inject tuberculin into the skin, into the dermal layer to elicit a reaction. So if there's TB infection, then you should get a more severe reaction that you can then measure through the skin thickness. And you can see the picture of the caliper there on the right-hand side where the skin thickness is being measured. You also get 2 types of intradermal tests for tuberculosis. You get the single and the comparative test. The single test you would just do with bovine tuberculin, whereas your comparative test you would use both the bovine tuberculin and at another different site, avian tuberculin. It's because you get different mycobacterium species. Some of them, Mycobacterium avium, that mainly affects birds, they could cross-react with your bovine TB reaction. So if you have both and you're using the bovine tuberculin and the avian tuberculin, then based on sort of the severity of reaction on the different tuberculins, it just helps you with your test interpretation and to rule out false positives. And then also you won't just rely on the skin test. When you slaughter positive animals, you'll still collect organ samples for culture to identify the mycobacterium involved and also hopefully the strain. And you can also collect milk samples. Once again, as with brucellosis, the interpretation is first done on a herd basis to determine is your herd positive or not, and then only you go back to your individual test results to decide which animals are currently testing positive or negative. Okay, so this triangle that I'm showing you here, sort of if you look there at the top part, that's sort of your tip of the iceberg. So that would be in a herd, the animals that are testing positive on your test. And then the slab just below that would be your animals that are actually infected, but they're not yet positive on your TB or brucellosis test. They're still incubating, so they're actually false negatives. And then the bigger block at the bottom, that will be the animal population that's negative on test, but that's truly negative. Okay, so this triangle just gives you an idea of once again approaching it as a herd disease, because your tests will never be 100% accurate on every single animal because of the incubation period. And then you'll see that small little triangle, the bottom right-hand corner. That would be your animals that are not infected, but come up positive on tests, and those would be your false positive reactors. So this just serves to remind you not to just take it as black and white when you get your test result, but to keep in mind that you can have false positive and false negative reactors. Okay, so the big question is then, why should dairy farmers actually care about these 2 diseases? Okay, so firstly, especially when it comes to brucellosis, but also tuberculosis, there's a very high risk in our country of acquiring brucellosis. For brucellosis, it's because we've got very low herd vaccination rates. We've got relatively low testing rates, especially for TB. We don't have movement control. That's for both brucellosis and tuberculosis. And here with movement control, I mean individual animal identification and where animals are always tested before they're moved. Animals are moved left, right, and center without being tested and without being monitored where they're coming from and where they're going to, unless, of course, the farm is under official quarantine. And then we've got a very, very high prevalence of especially brucellosis in the country, and I'll show you just now on some maps. Okay, so what is at risk when it comes to brucellosis and tuberculosis? It's the health and the production of our cattle herds, our dairy herds. It's the health of farmers, their workers, and the veterinary professionals or animal health professionals that work with these animals. And then also your farming operation as a whole, because these diseases definitely affect your profit and the growth of your enterprise and your herd as well. Okay, so here I'm showing you a map of the reported bovine brucellosis outbreaks in the last 5 years. You can see it's pretty much present in all 9 provinces. It's concentrated sort of in the central and your northeastern parts of the country. So pretty much where we farm with cattle, we unfortunately have brucellosis. Bearing in mind as well, these red dots are the outbreaks that have been detected in the last 5 years. So there'll be many herds that haven't been tested, or if they're positive, that might not have been reported to state veterinary services and effectively reported to the national office. So in actual fact, there would be a lot more red dots. So these are the ones that we know about. Okay, then looking at the reported bovine tuberculosis outbreaks in the last 5 years, you can see we've got a lot fewer cases. The red dots indicate cattle, the black dots indicate buffalo. Buffalo are tested before they're moved. You're not allowed to move buffalo from one farm to another without testing them, and they're always tested for brucellosis, tuberculosis, foot and mouth disease, and corridor disease because they are carriers of these diseases. So you'll see then in the Kruger National Park, obviously their TB has been picked up in lions and in other wildlife as well. So obviously the TB map doesn't look as scary, but my question there is, are we testing enough herds for tuberculosis? And also, are you testing them correctly? Because if you don't have a good technique when you're doing your intradermal testing and you're injecting straight through the skin, you're not really going to pick up your true reactors. And obviously, it's a bit more cumbersome if you do your tuberculin test because you need to visit the herd twice. You inject them at 0 hours and you need to go back 72 hours later to take your reading. So obviously that's a double visit. And yeah, are people actually doing this properly, going at the correct interval? Are they actually measuring the skin thickness, or are they just standing on the back of a bucking saying, yeah, no, it looks fine, and then they decide the herd's negative? So we really need to make sure that we're testing herds properly and reporting properly. Because I also don't think this is a true reflection of what's going on with regards to tuberculosis in the country. So your typical risk points for these 2 diseases, farmers often buy in infected cattle. So they pay good money for these diseases without knowing or asking the brucellosis or tuberculosis status of the animals. So there we need to ask ourselves, are we raising enough awareness about these diseases? You'll always get people that just don't care or that would purposefully move infected animals. But I think there are a lot of people that just don't know enough about these diseases and how severely their herds can be affected. So we always need to raise awareness on these 2 diseases. You also can get situations where farmers sell individual test negative animals, and that's why we put a lot of emphasis on these 2 diseases being herd diseases. If it's picked up in the herd, the whole herd is quarantined. You can't sell those test negative animals because they could still be incubating the disease. And then if you sell them to an unsuspecting farmer, within a few months, they sit with the same problem. So that's why the test negative animals from quarantine farms are not allowed to be moved. Okay, your initial tests on herds need to be conducted twice, and that would be 2 to 3 months apart, depending on if it's brucellosis or tuberculosis, and you do it on the whole eligible herd. Then also your auctions are typical risk points, and there you can ask the question if vendor declarations would help. So if the owner of the animals declares that they had the animals tested and they're negative, and also what proof do you need to provide them. Speculators typically a high risk because they buy animals from several different points, put them together where they can transmit diseases to each other and then sell them again. It makes your traceability really difficult if speculators are involved. And yeah, they're only interested in buying animals from one spot and then selling them again to another spot at a profit. So that's definitely a high risk activity. And yeah, then other risk points is also your neighboring farms. What activities are going on the neighboring farms, and are those animals healthy? Also, is there shared grazing? Are your fences intact? Is there wildlife on adjacent farms? Because both brucellosis and tuberculosis, like I said, it can be transmitted to most mammals. So it can be transmitted to wildlife, and wildlife can potentially transmit it back to cattle again. So the big thing here is biosecurity when it comes to your dairy farm. Okay, so in a dairy, why these two diseases are typically important is because of the infection pressure. It's extremely high in a dairy herd if brucellosis or tuberculosis is present, and it's because you've got a lot of animals in a small space. Dairies are very intensive production systems. You've got close contact of your animals, both in the camps and especially in the milking parlor. You can get contamination of your camps and your parlor if there was an abortion or if there was a birth in the camp, or sometimes even in the holding pen of the parlor potentially. And that's easily how brucellosis spreads. With tuberculosis, like I said, coughing in the parlor, and then also contamination of your feed and drinking troughs. Okay, then also if the bacteria are being shed in the milk from infected animals, if you use udder cloths, so if you're not using disposable paper towels, the udder cloths can spread it around from one animal to another. If you don't decontaminate your milk clusters or your equipment properly, you can transmit it. And then obviously your workers frequently have contact with the different animals, so it can spread to your workers and to other animals as well. So yeah, once again, biosecurity is the key, and prevention of these two diseases are essential. Okay, so then why is brucellosis important when it comes to the economics of the dairy? Okay, so firstly, if you have abortions within the affected herd, it means less calves. So you'll have less replacement heifers, which could be a big problem to the farmer. If you have weak calves that are born, they require extra inputs. So obviously that's taking away from your profit. Your cows that have, let's say, even if they calved normally, if they've got retained placentas, you need to treat that. They might take longer to get pregnant again. So all of these things are additional costs if your reproduction is adversely influenced. When it comes to the milk, brucella can be shed in the colostrum and in the milk. You can get a brucellosis mastitis that increases your SCC. It can increase your intercalving period, decrease your milk production, and never mind those production and reproduction parameters. When it comes to your farm being quarantined, obviously there's costs involved with that, and infected animals need to be slaughtered to remove them as a source of the bacteria on your farm. So obviously that affects the farmer financially. Okay, then we look at the economic impact of tuberculosis. So production is definitely affected. You get weight loss, deterioration, depending on where the bacteria is lodged, different organ lesions. So overall, you get a negative energy balance with a sick animal. So this will definitely affect your production and your reproduction efficacy. Mycobacteria can also be shed in the colostrum and the milk, so it can also increase your SCC count. You also have the cost of your quarantine measures, and infected animals also need to be slaughtered, which impacts on the dairy farm. Okay, so brucellosis requirements for a dairy. Okay, so it's legislated that all heifers in the country between 4 to 8 months of age have to be vaccinated against brucellosis. And we've got 2 vaccines available. We've got S19 and RB51. Both of these are live vaccines. Remember, if you're handling these vaccines, be careful not to stick yourself with a needle. Don't rub your eyes or eat or do anything like that while you're working with the vaccine. Or if you've potentially been exposed while working with the vaccine, you take the package insert to your doctor so that they know what you've been exposed to and how to treat you accordingly. Okay, so when it comes to the milk buyer, they require the brucellosis status of the dairy herd to ensure that the milk is safe. So you test the whole eligible dairy herd twice, 2 months apart with serological tests. And if they're negative on both these tests, then your state veterinarian can issue a BR3 certificate that the farmer then gives to the milk buyer. You can then go over to monthly milk ring tests on the bulk tank, but you should ideally repeat the herd serology at minimum every second year, or if you get any suspect milk ring test results, then ideally you should bleed the whole herd again and repeat your serology. Okay, tuberculosis requirements for dairy. So also your milk buyer needs information on the status of the herd. So here you'll test the whole eligible herd twice. You'll do it 3 months apart with your intradermal test. And if both these tests are negative, you'll issue a TB3 certificate. Remember here as well that usually if you go out and test the herd, you'll test for both brucellosis and tuberculosis at the same time, just making the visit more efficient. And then you'll just test for both these diseases every 3 months then. Okay, for TB then, there's biennial testing. So it's every second year that you repeat the intradermal test for TB, or if there's any disease suspicion, you would test them again. Okay, so when we're looking at current legislation, both brucellosis and tuberculosis are controlled animal diseases under the Animal Diseases Act. Okay, and under the Animal Diseases Regulations, we've got Table 2, which describes the basic control measures for all your control diseases, which includes brucellosis and tuberculosis. And for example, that's where it's stated that the brucellosis vaccination of heifers is compulsory between 4 to 8 months of age. We then also have the bovine brucellosis scheme and the bovine tuberculosis scheme, and both of these were promulgated in 1988. They're both voluntary schemes, meaning you're not forced to test unless your animals have already tested positive, but they aim for control and eventual eradication of the disease as well. So as soon as the herd is tested and they're identified as infected, they fall under government control and the farm is placed under quarantine so that we can try to get rid of the disease on the farm. Then we also have manuals available for brucellosis and tuberculosis in cattle, which contains a lot more detail on the disease, so on the diagnostics, the epidemiology, and the control thereof. And I've just given you the link there as well if you would like to access these two documents. Okay, so like I said, as soon as a herd is identified as infected, it's under government control and the property is quarantined. Okay, so no animals may then move onto the herd, onto the farm or off of the farm, only if slaughtered, and then they're only allowed to move under Red Cross permit, which is issued by the state vet. And there also you need to phone the abattoir beforehand to make sure that they're willing to accept the brucellosis or tuberculosis infected animals so that they can safely slaughter them at the end of the day. And yeah, you send them on a sealed truck with a Red Cross permit to make sure that no one offloads those animals somewhere on the way to the abattoir. Okay, so then in your infected herd, obviously you'll be removing those positive cattle because they're the source of the infection on your farm. And then as you're removing those positives, you'll be testing them or retesting them every 6 to 8 weeks or every 2 months for brucellosis or every 3 months for tuberculosis to then go through those animals that have currently tested negative to see if you're picking up any additional positive cattle. Then the question is, why the quarantine and the control measures? And yeah, I mean, it's not nice for the farmer that's under quarantine, but the big reason here is to protect other farmers, that the disease doesn't spread to other herds and affect other farmers. You need to prevent the further spread of the disease. That's why you institute the quarantine and control measures. Okay, so when you get infected herds with brucellosis, cattle are C branded on the right-hand side of the neck, and they're branded with a C because the common name for brucellosis is contagious abortion. So that's where the C comes from. And with TB, they are branded on the left-hand side of the neck with a T. And you can see a photo here on the right-hand side from Gauteng Veterinary Services. I unfortunately don't have one of a TB-infected animal, but yeah, same thing, T on the left-hand side of the neck. And the reason why animals are permanently identified like this is once again to protect other farmers and to prevent them from buying these animals unknowingly, and also then to protect your abattoir workers so that if the abattoir worker sees here's a cow with a C or a T on the neck coming in, then they know that animal's infected. But here awareness is also important because if no one knows what the C and the T brand means, you can sell these animals and the owner won't even know that they're infected. So once again, awareness plays a huge role. People should know if they see a C brand at an auction, those animals have been moved illegally. Same with the T brand. Okay, so in infected herds, you'll also aim to keep your cattle that have tested positive separate from the ones that have tested negative until you're able to slaughter them, also just to try to prevent transmission of the disease. Very important for brucellosis is not to allow positive cows to calve on the farm as far as you can, because during that calving process, they release those millions of bacteria. Or then at least try to let them calve down in a completely separate camp, or even if possible on a concrete camp so that you can clean afterwards. With brucellosis, we also advise the slaughter of your heifer calves born from infected cows. If they're infected in utero, it often takes them quite long to seroconvert so that you can pick them up on your serological test. And they usually only seroconvert once they have calved down themselves. And then that's then usually too late. They've already spread the disease again if they've calved. So they're typically responsible for the 2-year breakdown syndrome that we see in herds that we're trying to clean up. So we usually advise, if possible, if they're born from an infected cow, they need to be slaughtered as well and not bred with. Okay, so like I said, you remove your positive cattle through slaughter, otherwise they'll just keep spreading the infection. And yeah, realize that this is an extremely expensive and very intensive exercise for both brucellosis and tuberculosis. This is not something you would wish upon your worst enemy, and this is why these two diseases need to be prevented, because it's not fun to deal with while it's there. It's very, very difficult to get rid of. If you're lucky and if you do everything right and if everything goes according to plan, it will easily take you 2 years to rid yourself of these diseases. So it's a very intensive exercise. It's not a quick fix. Okay, so vaccination for brucellosis. The S19 vaccine that you can get from OBP, you're only allowed to give that to heifers between 4 to 8 months. The RB51, this is a different type of strain. It's not picked up on our serological test, so you can also use that between the 4 to 8 months of age period, but you can also booster vaccinate older cows that are not pregnant with RB51. So that's a benefit of using RB51. And yeah, like I said, beware of self-vaccination when using the brucellosis vaccines because they're live vaccines. And unfortunately, we do not have a vaccine available for TB for cows. I just want to highlight Section 11 of the Animal Diseases Act as well. If you read this section in the Act, it very clearly states that it's the responsibility of the owner or the manager of animals to prevent diseases from getting into their herds, to treat any disease if it's present, and also to prevent the spread to other herds. So it's not just the role of the vet or the state vet or industry to try and prevent diseases. It actually starts with the owner and the manager of the animals to keep their herds healthy, and if there's disease present, to deal with it and to prevent spread to other herds. Okay, so basically all of us are a very, very integral and important part when it comes to brucellosis and tuberculosis prevention and control. So the role of farmers here, they need to know the brucellosis and tuberculosis status of their herds, so they need to test accordingly. They need to vaccinate their heifers against brucellosis to help protect their herd and build up immunity. They should only buy cattle from negative herds where there's proof that there was herd testing and at herd level these animals are negative. Biosecurity, extremely important, prevent diseases from getting onto your farm and protect your assets. And then also they should be aware that both brucellosis and tuberculosis are zoonoses and can be transmitted to humans if it's present. So this is a very important piece of awareness that everyone that's involved on dairy farms repeatedly needs to tell farmers so that they're aware of these diseases and how to prevent it. Okay, then we're just quickly going to look at the history of TB and brucellosis control in South Africa. So we basically established a control and eradication program in 1969 that was based on the test and slaughter principle. So you would test herds. If they're positive, they're under quarantine, and then you would slaughter out the positive reactors. Still basically what we do now. So the occurrence of brucellosis and tuberculosis was actually very low in the mid to late 1980s. And take note here, this is before the brucellosis and tuberculosis schemes were published in 1988. So they already implemented those control measures, and government really put a lot of effort into controlling these diseases. So the initial schemes achieved good control at that point because there was government funding and available manpower that was prioritized at a national level for the control of both these diseases. There was also a good general compliance of livestock owners with regulatory requirements. But then since then, the late 1980s to early 1990s, the responsibility of continued brucellosis and TB testing and brucellosis vaccination was handed over to livestock owners. And the reason just being is this is really expensive control programs to run. And also, in essence, it is the owner's responsibility to prevent disease in their animals. Then we also had the provincialized structure that was introduced in 1996 with our constitution. And we've seen a gradual increase in the occurrence of these two diseases, especially brucellosis. And it's mainly due to non-compliance with the prescribed control measures. And with a provincialized structure, what makes it difficult as well, you don't know how to have a top-down approach where your national director can give order to the provinces to control the disease. Each province has got their own veterinary services, their own budget. So each province needs to deal with the disease accordingly. It just makes it a bit more difficult to manage. And you might then get in some provinces, the disease is dealt with a bit differently compared to others, depending, for example, on available manpower and budget. So, definitely these are things that have contributed to the lack of control over the last 2 to 3 decades. Okay, so now finally, after we've gotten the background information on these two diseases, have we lost the battle? Okay, so both brucellosis and tuberculosis prevention and control, like we said, is a shared responsibility. First and foremost, the farmer or the owner or the manager of the animals, and then also veterinary services. And that's private veterinary services and your government veterinary services and all role players that are involved in the dairy health. So the farmer needs to take responsibility, like we said, vaccinate the heifers against brucellosis, test the herd as required, deal with the reactors, and only buy in animals from herds that have tested negative for brucellosis and tuberculosis. Remembering here, that good fences make good neighbors. If you allow your cattle to mingle with the neighbor's cattle and you don't know what their disease status is, very easy to pick up the disease that way. So it's a better idea not to share grazing or mixed cattle unless you really know what the status of the other animals are. And then be careful of showgrounds or any place where cattle from a lot of different areas conglomerate and then thereafter go back to their respective properties again. It's easy to spread disease that way. Okay, so we've got some remaining problems that require collective responsibility and control. So basically with neighboring cattle, you often get dairy farms that border either beef farms or communal farms, or even on the same property. You might get a dairy herd, a beef herd, and a communal farm as well. So then it becomes quite difficult, especially if these herds are in contact with each other, because they can transmit disease. We see a lot of instances of fences being cut and animals being chased onto different properties, so it's easy for them to spread disease. Cattle also bought under false declarations and unverified test results, or someone might say, yes, my herd tested negative, or not providing the herd test proof, or let's say the herd was last tested 2 or 3 years ago, so that certificate isn't really valid anymore. Okay, so here, government veterinary services, your private vets, industry, South African Police Services, the Livestock Association, community leaders, all of us need to communicate and work together, because if we really attend to these diseases, if we're aware of them and aware that they're a problem, we can really work together to start cleaning up farms and cleaning up areas as well. I mean, if you get an area where livestock farmers decide to stand together, if they've got the disease, they want to get rid of it, or if they don't have the disease, they want to prevent it. If you stand together, then it's a lot easier keeping that disease out. Whereas if you're just trying to survive on your own, you've got a lot of threats around you all the time. So it is better to tackle these two diseases together. Just a word then also on the veterinary strategy. So in 2014, the World Organization for Animal Health conducted a performance of veterinary services gap analysis. So that basically assessed the whole of veterinary services across the country And they said, here are your strengths, here are your weaknesses, here you're doing a good job, here you can still improve. And this report then led to the development of the South African veterinary strategy and how we aim to improve veterinary services. And that's both at a government and private level. So the 6 pillars of this strategy is firstly focusing on the veterinary authority, animal health, VPH, feed and food safety, your food and veterinary laboratory diagnostics, animal product identification, recording and traceability, and then also animal welfare. I gave some tables here that breaks up the strategy a bit more. And you can see there in the middle row, animal health. In the middle there, you've got your brucellosis policy. So this is where they decided that they're going to use brucellosis as the model disease. It's not the most important disease in the country, but you need a lot of good control measures in place to be able to properly control this disease. So if we can control brucellosis better, we can use the same framework that we're implementing to control other diseases as well. So just to highlight that the brucellosis policy is part of our bigger veterinary strategy. Okay, it's just the rest of the table there. Like I said, brucellosis has been selected as the model disease. And the policy document that's been sent out aims to set out and clarify, firstly, the broader framework of the disease control strategy that we need to follow for bovine brucellosis control in cattle, and also going to provide guidelines on the different roles and responsibility for the implementation of this policy. And once again, it refers to collective control. There's not one entity that's responsible for this. All of us need to work together. Okay, so this is just what the policy document looks like. And I just gave you a link here as well if you would like to read it. It gives you a very good background on sort of what works and what doesn't work, and where do we need to improve, and how should we aim to tackle this problem. Okay, so the next step after this policy document is to focus on implementation plans for the objectives that we've set. Okay, so like I said, once we've got a successful brucellosis policy implementation, it would then be a lot easier to attach something like TB control to it, because then your framework will already be set. Okay, so these are the 7 objectives that the policy focuses on for brucellosis. So it's vaccination, education and awareness, testing, movement control, slaughter, reporting, and then, of course, the effective implementation of your control measures. We're almost done. Just some of the success stories that we've had with brucellosis and tuberculosis. For both these diseases, we've got working groups with state vet representatives from all the province. We've also got a brucellosis steering committee that's been set up by the National Animal Health Forum. So these groups do have a lot of expertise and influence and help with further policy and implementation plan development. Then there's been various awareness materials that's been developed and distributed widely for brucellosis over the last 6-7 years. We've got the Control Disease Week for final year vet students, where we focus on control diseases, legislation, and specifically on brucellosis and tuberculosis. So this really equips the final year students well for their CCS year. Then we have SANAS accreditation and Directorate Animal Health approval of 7 out of the 9 provincial vet labs for brucellosis, and then also 4 additional private/university labs. So just showing that in most of the provinces, we are geared to properly test for brucellosis. Then there are a lot of local research projects on brucellosis, and this has really increased a lot. If you go to Google Scholar and you try to find South African brucellosis articles prior to 2015, you'll only pick up a handful. But if you check on Google Scholar for after 2015, it's markedly increased. And we need this research so that we can make informed decisions on brucellosis control. So it's great that the research has increased. Then we also have Provincial Animal Health Forum brucellosis CPDs in each province in both 2017 and 2020. So that just really helps a lot with the awareness. And the National Institute for Communicable Diseases has also initiated some human brucellosis research projects. Unfortunately, with COVID, some of the work here has been halted, but hopefully as we recover from the COVID pandemic, we'll start focusing on other diseases again. Okay, and these pictures are just examples of a social media campaign that the SABC and several stakeholders embarked upon. This was at the end of, now I must just remember, I think it was the end of 2020 that we embarked on this, just to share information for the public and people farming with cattle on what brucellosis is. Yeah, so just some examples there. Okay, and then just in terms of the way forward, so we do have very good legislation for both brucellosis and tuberculosis, and the current legislation as is should still be applied. With the brucellosis policy, the next step is the development of the detailed implementation plans. This is something that's unfortunately taking longer than we anticipated, and it's just due to a lot of other challenges. Quite sure that you're aware of the foot and mouth disease outbreak that we're still dealing with. We've got African swine fever, avian influenza, rabies outbreaks. So there are a lot of diseases circulating currently. So we need to push more to make sure that we develop these implementation plans for brucellosis, and so we don't forget about brucellosis as we focus on things like FMD. So for the implementation plans, you do need socioeconomic impact assessments to be done and budget determinations, and then also determine your different roles and responsibilities. So the question of, or the answer to the question we asked earlier, have we lost the battle? Unfortunately, not very clear-cut, but the battle is not lost at this moment in time. It is ongoing. There's a lot happening. There's a lot of positive things happening. On a lot of farms, the disease is being effectively managed, controlled, and prevented. But then there are other farms in other areas where it feels like we're losing the battle a bit. So we need to work together. This battle's not over, and it is something that we can improve upon. So the important thing here is do what you can with what you have. So if you, as a veterinarian, for example, if you're working with a dairy farmer and you make them attentive and aware on these diseases and you help them to prevent it, you're saving that farmer thousands upon thousands of rand, preventing the diseases from getting into the herd. So if you get people that are willing to work with you, share all the knowledge and information that you have. There's a lot that we can do just with knowledge and with awareness, which is really important. So if you need more information on these diseases, go and have a look at the brucellosis and tuberculosis manuals that I gave you the link of earlier in the presentation. And then if you want information on the diseases in humans, so for brucellosis, you can go to the NICD website. Then you can also go to our departmental website. This is also where you'll find those, the manuals, and you'll also find the brucellosis policy document there. And then if you go onto the National Animal Health Forum website with brucellosis, a lot of information there. And there's also very good awareness materials that you can access there. And you can feel free to share that with farmers, anyone involved with animal health, farming with cattle, dairy farmers. Very good information that you can distribute to them. And there are also some talks that have been recorded and video clips. So there's a lot of different types of awareness materials that you can use. Okay, thanks a lot for your time. And if you have any questions, please feel free to ask.
Thank you, Dr. Cloete. We do have some questions in the chat bar, and then some of them has already been addressed, but let's give Charles, who raised his hand, the opportunity to ask a question, and then I will read the rest.
Okay, great. Go ahead,
Yes,
Charles.
Charles is speaking from Northbridge. I just want to ask Dr. Cloete, in the past, few years ago, we used to have training and certification for those who conduct TB and CA, especially in the state vet area. But for so many years now, the program has been discontinued, probably after Dr. Akron retired. And what I've noticed is even private vets and state vets that are presently occupying the position have not yet conducted such tests, such courses. So when you were speaking about conducting proper skin tests for TB, I think it's something that is a problem. And when recently you see private vets certifying TB test, the way it is conducted is not the way the national department used to handle and train people to conduct it. And those animals still goes out on export. So what is happening now? What is there going to be a reintroduction of such a program so that those who are involved will know how to test those animals for TB and CA?
So thank you, Charles. That's a very good question and a very good comment as well. What we've already done to mitigate the fact that you might get officials that don't know how to test properly, the animal health technicians that qualify from the 3 different technicons do a brucellosis and tuberculosis training course where they teach them how to bleed the animals properly for brucellosis and how to conduct the TB testing properly. So they've been implementing that over the last few years. So your newly qualified animal health technicians should have gone through that course, how to do the testing properly. Then also with the final year vet students, also for the last couple of years, they've got that controlled animal diseases course, and they focus a lot on tuberculosis and brucellosis, and they teach them how to inject the tuberculin intradermally there. So also, once again, your newly qualified vets should know how to conduct those tests. You're correct. In the past, there was a national training program where the state vets and technicians sort of received either, if they're new in state vet services, they received an introductory course or they received refresher courses as well every few years. But yeah, due to resource and manpower constraints, it's not conducted at a national level anymore. And it's up to provincial veterinary services to identify the need for training. So if the provincial veterinarian services see that they've got a lot of new officials starting with positions, or if they feel that their existing officials need to be retrained, then they can still offer those training courses. I think it's, once again, it comes down to resources and manpower. That's often an issue in the provinces. So there, in order for you to, if you're aware of any problems in specific areas or specific problems, take it up with the state veterinarian, or you're more than welcome to contact me as well so that we can talk to the brucellosis representative, because there's no point in doing tests if you're not doing it properly. Then just, yeah, on another note, we do realize that on a national level, we need to up our game with regards to training. So for specifically brucellosis, we want to look at introducing a CPD course so that we can give refresher courses to vets and animal health technicians. Brucellosis is a bit easier to do because you can easily do it as a webinar or online, whereas with tuberculosis, you do need that practical component that's a bit more difficult to organize. But we are looking at re-establishing sort of central courses. It won't necessarily be run through our national office, but we're going to help to set it up so that vets and paravets can participate. So unfortunately, that process isn't done yet, but it is in the pipeline. Thanks, Charles.
Thank you.
Okay. Thank you. I'm just going to read the questions. Good morning, Doctor. What is the sensitivity of brucellosis bacteria to factors such as heat? If it is shed through birth fluids or placenta, does the bacteria have a limited survival period in a dry, hot environment if not exposed to other animal that can be affected? Okay,
now that's a very, very good question, because like we said, during that birth or abortion process, a lot of bacteria get shed. So the bacteria is sensitive to UV light, and it is sensitive to desiccation or drying out and heat. So if you're somewhere in the Karoo where there's very little grass, very little moisture, and lots of sunlight, it would kill that bacteria a lot quicker. Whereas if you're somewhere, let's say you're down in the Cape, there's lots of grass. Let's say the cow aborted close to a water trough and in the shade where it's moist and it's cool, that bacteria can survive a lot longer. And brucellosis and tuberculosis have been known to survive quite a couple of months in moist, wet environments. And that, like I said, accounts for microclimates as well, along a water trough or in the shade. So if you have an instance where a cow aborted and it's in a veld, best thing is to try to burn the area where she calved, and you can also throw some lime on the area. it's a bit difficult to establish like exactly how many hours or how many days they survive, because it depends on so many factors, including your soil pH as well. But I mean, they would die, let's say, within a day or two if they're adequately exposed to sunlight and dried out, but they can survive quite long when it's moist and when it's cool.
Okay, thank you. And is it ideal to take calves born from a BR-infected cow to the feedlot immediately after weaning, just to fatten them before they get slaughtered?
That definitely is an option. The thing there is just it's much better to do that than to breed those heifer calves. But remember that that whole herd is going to be under quarantine. So you can't just send that heifer calf to a feedlot without the state vet knowing, because you're actually effectively sending a diseased animal there. What we do want to aim to do in future is to actually get dedicated feedlots that can receive such animals and fatten them up before they're slaughtered, because then at least you're utilizing the animal properly. The problem is just currently feedlots do every now and again sell animals out of the feedlot. So if someone doesn't care that that's a brucellosis infected animal and a buyer comes along and says, oh, those heifers look nice, I want to buy 20 of them, then they take those heifers to their farm and start breeding with them. So I want to say under controlled feedlot conditions, that's definitely a very good idea. It's just not, I want to say, a regulated practice at this stage, but it's also something that we are looking into. Yeah, because that's about much better utilization of an infected animal to fatten them up first.
Okay, now how can I get more support from my local state vet, as I've been waiting for my BR certificate for more than 5 years?
You'll definitely need to elevate it. If you're not getting much joy out of the responsible state vet in your area, I would suggest that you approach the provincial director to ask to get that certificate. If you've contacted the provincial director and you're also not getting much joy there, then you are welcome to approach our national office, or you can send me an email as well. But you first just need to exhaust that provincial channel because it's their responsibility. If you're getting no answers, then you can approach our national office as well.
And we've got to comment that more awareness should be raising amongst the rural farmers, as they provide a great threat or risk to the commercial farmers. And then, does the government compensate farmers for culling infected cattle?
Okay, or just a comment on the rural versus commercial farmers. Yeah, that sort of goes two ways. You get commercial farmers that sell their infected cattle to unsuspecting communal farmers and spread the disease to them. And you get the reverse, where communal farmers might, for example, cut fences and chase the infected animals onto someone else's property and spread the infection that way. So it definitely goes both ways. And we need increased awareness at both commercial and communal level, at both commercial and rural level as well. Because a lot of people don't know about the impacts of this disease, and you'll also get a few that just don't care. But improved awareness at all levels, definitely. Then when it comes to compensation, slaughtering animals that are infected with brucellosis, you send them to the abattoir, like we said, under controlled conditions. You can also fatten them up. And then you still receive the slaughter value or the full carcass value for that cow. So we don't compensate because you do still get that slaughter value. But once again, focus is on preventing the disease in the herd, because obviously with the dairy, it's very detrimental if you lose your replacement heifers or your cows that are in milk. And if you think about a stud, if you get brucellosis in a stud, I mean, those animals are really, really valuable. And you don't want to then just get slaughter value out of it. So you need to make sure that your herds are safe.
Okay, thank you. What is the benefit of using S19 over RB51? And apart from the other being a once-off vaccination, how can a person ensure complete protection and against being infected?
Okay, so S19 versus RB51, it's really fine if you use any one of the two in your heifers between 4 to 8 months of age. A lot of people believe that the S19 vaccine is a bit more potent or offers a better immunity. But if you actually look at literature, there aren't really a lot of very specific studies comparing the two vaccines. But a lot of people do believe that S19 is better to use during that 4 to 8 months of age. And yeah, there are also people that say that you do get sort of a lifelong immunity if you use S19. But yeah, it would depend on a lot of factors. Like once again, with the dairy herd, you know, it's an intensive production system. And like we know with the COVID vaccines as well, you can really compare the brucellosis vaccines there. It won't necessarily prevent infection, but it can help to decrease the shedding and decrease the spread within a herd. But once again, in a dairy parlor where if there's lots of bacteria, let's say if there were multiple abortions, a lot of animals that are in contact with each other, then it almost overrides your vaccination and animals will still get infected. So your infection pressure plays a huge role. And your vaccine is definitely not a silver bullet. You can't rely on vaccination to prevent brucellosis. That's impossible. So the biggest thing, if you want to prevent brucellosis, is to look at biosecurity in its entirety. Vaccination is one of your tools, and then you need to make sure that you're keeping a closed herd that's adequately fenced off, and always, always, always make sure that you get negative animals from negative herds that have been tested for both brucellosis and tuberculosis. So it's the important thing is looking at your biosecurity as a whole, and vaccination is only a small part thereof.
Okay, then what would you say are the percentages of false positives and false negatives?
That's also, it's not really possible to just give you a figure. It should be low. If you've got false positives or negative, it should usually, let's say, be something like 1 to 5%. It should be low. But it does also, for example, depend on other bacteria that might be present on the farm. For example, if you've got Yersinia bacteria present on the farm, they can cross-react with your brucellosis serological test, and you might get a higher proportion of false positives. But there, like I said, it's also important after you've done serology, you do also collect samples for culture, because your culture will definitely tell you, do you have brucellosis or tuberculosis or not? When it comes to Mycobacterium avian, so the avian myco tuberculosis, we do every now and again see sort of false positive reactions there, but it's also something that you can rule out via culture. So it's never just one test and there you go. If you're uncertain or if the picture doesn't look right, you can definitely retest. And I mean, also when it comes to false negatives, that's why you repeatedly test a herd for brucellosis and tuberculosis when you're cleaning up the herd. So if you miss them during the first round, you should pick them up during the second round. So that's where repeat testing really helps you to identify if something was false positive and false negative, and then additional tests like culture.
Okay, and can brucellosis be transmitted to human around the milking table if no proper PPF is worn?
Potentially, yes. If you're thinking about it, let's say if you've got a highly infected herd, if most of them are infected, they're shedding the bacteria in the milk, and let's say you're busy adding the milking clusters and your hands are full of that infected milk and you're rubbing your eyes, technically you can get it from a milking parlor. The most common way that humans get it is through drinking and eating unpasteurized dairy and dairy products from infected herds. And then also if a cow aborted or calved down, if you're the one picking up the placenta and throwing it away and you don't wear adequate PPE or wash your hands, then you can pick up the disease. And then, like I said, through the use of the live vaccines, if you're not careful with how you use it.
Okay, and then finally, before we go to Luke, the RB51 vaccine pamphlet specifies that animals' milk should be pasteurized if a vaccine is administered post-calving. And would that only be for that specific lactation or for the calves or the cow's entire lifespan?
That should usually only account for that lactation that she's in after you vaccinated her. The reason why this was actually added to the pamphlet, there was a very interesting case in the US where a person got RB51 infection from drinking unpasteurized milk. But this came from a herd that was certified as brucellosis free. They regularly test that herd and they didn't test positive. And then they found out that it must have been the RB51 organism that went to the udder and got excreted into the milk, and that's how the person got the infection. So it's something that really shouldn't happen often. That's like almost a 1 in a million case. But just to take precaution, because RB51 is also a live brucellosis vaccine, it is then safer if you're using it to just make sure that during that lactation that the bulk milk is actually pasteurized.
Okay, and can the Brucella bacterium spread via needles when bleeding a positive herd?
Technically, yes. With brucellosis, it likes it goes throughout the body during your bacteremic phase, and then it lodges itself in different organs. And with brucellosis, it's typically your udder and your uterus. So an animal shouldn't stay bacteremic for too long, meaning the organism shouldn't continuously circulate in the blood. But you always do have that chance that you have an acutely affected animal that's still in the fever and bacteremic phase. And if you then stick a needle into the tail vein with that acutely infected animal and use that same needle and stick it into another animal's tail vein, you could technically spread the infection. So it's always better to use one needle per animal, but I know it's not very practical, but best practice would be one needle, one animal.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Cloete. Now we will give a chance for Luke, who raised his hand, and I think that will be our last question. Luke, you can unmute yourself.
Good afternoon, Dr. Cloete. How are you this afternoon, Doctor?
Very good, thanks, Luke. And you?
I'm good, thank you, Doctor. It's a very interesting course that we're working through, ma'am. Ma'am, I just want to have a few questions. With regards to the tuberculosis and brucellosis, has it been found that's affected dairy goat herds?
Yes, we have actually had cases where it's infected goats as well. Interesting there also with Brucella abortus, that's your bovine brucellosis that typically affects cows, but it can also affect, for example, sheep and goats. But then in goats, you get another type of organism called Brucella melitensis. So that's one that more typically affects your sheep and goats, but it can also spread to cattle. So all those red dots that I showed you was the Brucella abortus cases, so that's bovine brucellosis, but we have had cases of Brucella melitensis in the past. And yeah, also the problem now with your goat dairy herds is you also actually need your milk to be certified. And also almost want to say we lack a bit in terms of testing guidelines for the dairy herds, because it's sort of a newer or a smaller dairy structure compared to cattle dairy herds. So yeah, there have been cases and instances, but it's almost want to say minuscule compared to our bovine population.
Thank you, Dr. Cloete. That was actually my next question, is about testing, how to make sure that your dairy goat and the goat you're buying in are now free. Is there like maybe a body we can contact for testing, or even if you're buying, let's say for dairy cattle, let's say you're running both the dairy goats and dairy cattle on separate parts of a certain property, how do you ensure the certificate you're receiving for the brucellosis and tuberculosis is actually going to say correct? It's the proper certificate, it's not something somebody is falsified.
Yeah, that's a very good question, Luke. I would suggest that if you face a scenario like that, to contact the responsible state veterinarian to ask them if they can verify the certificates. Because let's say you're farming in Mpumalanga and the goats that you want to obtain come from Northwest, then you ask your state vet, can they contact the state vet there on the Northwest side so that they can verify what type of testing was done, who did it, was it done properly, when was it done, so that you can add that level of verification. We do have a guideline available for TB testing in sheep and goats that just describes the process, because you can't use that thick McClintock needle that's suitable for bovine skin. You can't use it on sheep and goats. You need to use a thinner needle, and it's a bit more difficult to get it right. And then with brucellosis, you just do serological tests as well. And you just need to send it to a lab that's accredited for Brucella melitensis testing. So I would say your best contact point would be your local state veterinarian. And if they can't help you directly, then you can ask them to refer you to their brucellosis and tuberculosis representative in the province, which should have adequate info. And if they don't have it, then they'll refer you to our national office. But start through your local state vet.
Okay, seems as though we finished.
Thank you,
Dr.
ma'am.
Alicia?
Doctors also.
Not finished.
Sorry,
You have another
Doctor, I've just got
question.
one last question.
No worries.
Sorry, Mr. Perfect. I know I'm asking a lot of questions. You're speaking about the dedicated feedlots for the brucellosis. If somebody, I might be interested in perhaps doing that in the future, to assisting with that program, how would I go about, or who shall I contact regarding that?
Okay, let's say if you're interested in doing something like that, or if you know of a feedlot that's interested, first thing that you would need to do is set up a traceability plan. Like you would need to be able to show through SOPs and manuals, how are you going to make sure that the animals that come onto your property are properly identified, you can fully trace them back to where they originated from, and how can you prove and ensure that none of those animals will be allowed to leave that feedlot except through slaughter, and you should have record and traceability all the way to the abattoir. So you need to be able to prove beyond a shadow of a doubt that no one will be able to buy any animals or remove them off of that feedlot property. Once you've got sort of the evidence and the protocols and the auditing in place, once again, you would approach your local state veterinarian. Usually they would audit the setup as well to see if it's sort of worth its weight in gold and if it can work. And then that should be elevated then to the provincial director and the national director for approval of such facility. We haven't yet audited and approved such a facility, so it would be something that's new. Anything that's new takes a bit longer, just because you need to make sure that you're regulating it properly. But if more and more people start to do it, then it becomes easier at a provincial, national level to set up our own guidelines of what exactly you need to become approved to run an operation like that. So yeah, the first person that's going to try this is going to have a lot of paperwork and a lot of hoops to jump through, but then it should make it easier for subsequent people to do that. So yeah, first thing is get all your ducks in a row, and then approach your local state vet so that it can go through the provincial director and national director's offices. Thank you, Luke, for your questions.
Thank you, Doctor.
Thank you, Dr. Alicia. Thank you for your time and all your preparation, and for the thorough presentation that you gave. Wishing you luck with all your work. And
well, thanks a lot, and thanks for the opportunity, and thanks everyone for asking questions. It means you're listening and you're interested. So thanks a lot for all the questions.